sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Services.
Welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I'm Gul Beckerman, an editor at the New York Times Book Review, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Peter Godfrey Smith to talk about his new book, Metazoa: Animal Life and the Birth of the Mind. Nice to see you, Peter.
Thanks, it's great to be part of this.
So let me start off with sort of a basic question for people who might have forgotten their 8th grade biology class, but it will lead us in, I think, to the book. What is the difference between protozoa and metazoa? And from there, maybe why was metazoa a useful name, useful title to give to this book?
Those are both old words now that are not used much anymore. In some ways, you would have had to have been in 8th grade in about 1920, I think, to have been fully part of that language. But the idea was that the metazoa are the animals in a strong literal sense, the higher animals, the true animals, and the protozoa are the small creatures that are sort of pre-animals or not quite animals, which are now usually referred to as protists. And metazoa has fallen to some extent out of use, but I like the word. It's a word for the animal kingdom as a whole, thinking about the whole thing, animal life, the animal kingdom. And it, of course, has that nice extra connotation where the word meta suggests looking down on or taking a sort of vantage point above a certain sort of thing. So it's about all the animals, looking at them from a vantage point that we can take, looking at them as a whole, basically.
Right. And that vantage point in this book is this question of consciousness, right? Generally speaking. And so let's talk about how you define consciousness, or have attempted to define consciousness in this book, because I understand that you say in the book, I have it here, you say our present understanding is not good enough to insist on one language or another, that it's a broad range of things. So walk us through a bit what the varieties of consciousness were as you encountered them in the animal world.
Sure. I'll start with the category itself, which has changed quite a bit, even in recent years, even over the last few decades. When I was a student in philosophy and consciousness was controversial in its way, the way people would set things up usually is the idea, is a way where experience is a very broad category, or feeling is a broad category, and consciousness is something narrower and more sophisticated within that category. So humans are conscious, other animals might just have experience. That's a way you might put it. Then as things developed around the turn of a century, the word consciousness just acquired a much broader meaning, in part influenced by Thomas Nagel and his famous "What is it like to be a bat" paper, where he said what he's really trying to understand, and what is hard to understand, is why there's something it's like, or something it feels like to be me and to be you and to be other conscious humans. And that's the hard thing to understand, the something it's like feature. Now that's used very broadly now. And as a consequence, if someone wonders, is there something it's like to be a squid or something it's like to be a bee, that has just become the question, are those animals conscious? I'm always a bit wary about that terminological change. I wish it hadn't happened, but it has happened. I think the word consciousness does still suggest a particular sophisticated form of experience or awareness. Right. It does to me. But that's the way things have gone. So what we're trying to do, and what I do in the book, is take a tour through a large part of the animal kingdom, one organized in a way around a long scuba dive, and try to work out which of the animals that I'm encountering, which of the animals that we might encounter on such a tour are such that it's something it feels like to be them, which ones experience their lives from their own point of view, which ones feel things happen, and which ones just sort of have things happen to them in a sense.
Right. So how do you distinguish that? I mean, how do you understand what is, instinct, for example, which I imagine you would kind of categorize as differently than consciousness, in this kind of broad understanding of consciousness, even.
I don't actually categorize it differently. I
Okay.
think of it as an open question.
Hmm.
I mean, suppose an animal's doing something instinctively. I think it's an open question whether the fact that it's instinctive means that it doesn't feel like something to be doing it. And I think probably in many cases it does. So instinct, I think of as the question of instinct versus learned or more intelligent behaviors, I think of as a separate thing. And the question, and as we make it more precise, in some ways it does seem to become ever more intractable. The question is, among the great range of sophistication that we see in animal behaviors, among the different ways of engaging with the world, which ways of engaging with the world bring with them subjective experience, bring with them the what it's like property? And I don't think there's a single method we can use to answer that question. I think it's a matter of piecing together different kinds of evidence, different kinds of considerations, looking at which sorts of activities in our own case have particular associations with conscious experience, and then looking for analogues of those in others. Also looking at the nature of nervous systems and just trying to bring a story together. Now, one of the things that I think a point we get to quite readily from an evolutionary point of view is that it's not going to be an on or off property. We can't expect it to be the case that as you sort of swim through a reef, there are animals for which the lights are on and animals for which the lights are off, with a sort of dichotomous distinction there. It's going to be a gradient. There are going to be cases where experience is, in a sense, part present, part absent. And that also we have to find a way to grapple with. We have to try to find a way to think about intelligently.
Right. Before we go further, let me tell the audience watching us that you can ask questions in the Q&A function, and we will have a Q&A session, shortly. We'll take those. Does as science broadly speaking sort of helped at all figuring out, say, like, is the brain waves of a fish been measured to understand sort of at what point they seem to be experiencing things in certain ways and certain things in others? Do we have a lot of research into this question?
This is a very active area, and I think of it as a very important one. Part of what I try to do in one of the later chapters of the book is give a bit of a jolt or induce a shift in how people think about what sorts of things brains are and what sort of thing the nervous system is. So when I was a student doing bits and pieces of philosophy and bits and pieces of science and learning about the brain, the picture that we were encouraged to have, and the picture that people are often still encouraged to have, is that a brain is essentially a large signaling network. You've got nodes in a network, and cells talk to other cells. They make them fire or make them less likely to fire. And these network properties, cell-to-cell network interactions, are all there is to work with if you're trying to give an understanding of how experience might be possible, what sort of things subjective experience or consciousness might be. And in recent years, there's been a shift, and one that I think has become quite helpful and quite important in making sense of those questions. Well, we don't think of a brain just as a signaling network of that kind, a network of semi-discrete nodes, but as an entity that has large-scale dynamic properties of different kinds, including oscillations, rhythms that characterize the whole or large parts of the whole, field effects, more holistic ways that electrical activity in the brain can affect its own changes through time, including affecting individual cells. Francis Crick, interestingly, the DNA Crick and Watson, he was one of the first people in neuroscience, and he was coming to neuroscience initially as an outsider from molecular biology of a different kind. He was one of the first to look closely at the ways in which these large-scale dynamic features, these oscillations, might be important in explaining what consciousness is. Now, this process of trying to think about the neural analogs of consciousness in terms of these large-scale properties is still developing. I couldn't say that we have a definite test such that we could look at a fish, for example, and say that the activities there, including the wave activities, are such that we can be confident it's conscious. Right. But a theme that I think is surprising and important is that some of these dynamic features of brains, many of them in fact, that were initially thought of as perhaps a big deal in the case of human experience. So Crick was looking at human experience in particular. These have analogues all over the animal kingdom. Flies and bees, not just fish. Octopuses also have these dynamic processes within their brains that have interesting connections to things like wakefulness, attention, consciousness relevant features of our own brain activity.
Right. I'm curious if you sort of developed your own theory of why consciousness evolved. I mean, what the driver was of that evolution. And, I'm speaking here of consciousness in the broadest sense, but why, I guess, it seems fairly obvious to me why it benefits us as humans, but what's the understanding that kind of looking at it in this broader way gave you about its general, what was actually pushing it to the fore as a feature of animal brains?
There's a way in which the view I prefer and defend in the book does not engage directly with the question, what is the function of consciousness? Now, that's a question that many people are currently asking in a particular way, where what people do is they imagine a coherent acting animal and then ask, taking all that for granted, animal action, animal perception, that way of being, what might be added on top that's useful if you made that creature conscious? And I don't think of that as the right way to approach the question. The view that I prefer, in a way, has two parts, the sort of two components to the view. The first part is an argument that the kind of way of being and being in the world that an active, mobile animal has inherently implies or brings with it some of what falls under the umbrella or into the category of experience or conscious experience. So there's a story I try to tell that involves the beginning of animals, nervous systems, new forms of action, including mobility, new kinds of sensing that feed those actions and that become part of feedback loops between what is sensed and what is done. There's a story about the development of the animal way of being that I think brings with it automatically a bunch of stuff that counts as aspects of consciousness. So having a point of view, having a perspective, acting from a perspective, having things seem a certain way, and so on. So there's one part of the story that gets handled that way, where consciousness is, roughly speaking, an inevitable part of the animal way of being once it acquires a certain kind of sophistication. And then there's a part that has to do with some of those peculiarities of nervous systems that we talked about a few minutes ago. Right. And that's not something that is an automatic feature of how any animal would have to be. It's something that the evolution of nervous systems just gave us in a certain form. And one of the things in the book that I battle with, and I'm still battling with, is exactly how the two components fit together. The part of the story that's based on just animal life in general and the part of the story that's based on physical peculiarities of nervous systems and what they do.
Right, right. Talk to me a bit about the octopus. I know that this is obviously the subject of your last book, but it has an important part to play here in this conversation. Also, you talk about it as an animal that kind of provides us with a different way of thinking about what it means to be an animal, right? This kind of the decentralized nervous system, the way that one can imagine an octopus or see how an octopus sort of experiences the world. But why? How does understanding or examining kind of the life and mind of the octopus give us insight into animal consciousness more generally?
The network of similarities and differences is just so interesting. So on the similarity side, they're very visual animals. They have large nervous systems. They're mobile. And they have a kind of exploratory way of being, a kind of inquisitive intelligence in at least some species. It's quite human-like. It's very recognizable, the kind of the way they attend and engage with novel objects and things like that. There's good evidence for the presence of pain in octopuses. In some ways, better evidence now than there was even when the book Metazoa came out, thanks to some new work by Robin Crook in Santa Barbara. And I think the case that they are a sentient invertebrate is very strong. So there you have the similarities. And then you have the differences, the ways in which they diverge utterly from our way of being. It's a body with almost no hard parts at all, one that can take on almost any shape. If you're thinking about the evolution of action, which I do a lot in Metazoa, then having a body that has this combination of flexibility and uncontrollability is a complete wild card in the evolution of action. The means they have for sensing includes all sorts of surprises from our point of view. The fact that they can sense light, it seems, with the whole body using the skin. That decentralized nervous system where some of the motions of the arms seem to be at least locally, to some extent, locally controlled by the arm itself. So on one hand, they give us a sense, right, here's a sentient invertebrate that evolved on a different line from us. And the way it's wound up recognizable from our point of view as sentient and having a kind of inquisitive intelligence tells us something about the role of those features in the evolutionary process. And then there's those wildcard differences, the ways in which they live completely differently. This asocial, short-lived, pretty skilled learner with a body that can take on any form and do anything, with a body that has parts that may make some of their own local decisions. It's an animal that, if they didn't existed, we would be in, I think, much worse shape in trying to understand the range of ways of being an active and sentient animal.
Oh, interesting. One of the things I found fascinating in the book is the conversation about dreaming, which we think of as such a kind of fundamentally human thing. But you cite research that, it's possible that rats dream, that cuttlefish dream, that they enter into a REM state, something that seems like it might be a REM state, right? Can you talk a little bit about more of the dreaming? What are cuttlefish dreaming about?
Yeah, this is something which is also changing on the scientific side very rapidly. Almost as we speak, there's been a lot of new work coming out. The idea that there are two phases of sleep, a sort of more active and a more quiescent phase, where the more active phase is associated with dreaming, that feature of our sleep, active and quieter sleep, dreams more characterizing the active state. This has also turned out to be something that's unexpectedly common, or at least the distinction between the two modes of sleep, unexpectedly common across the animal kingdom, with cuttlefish, also lots of vertebrate animals. And then the question arises whether there's something experiential or experience-like in some of those modes of sleep. Cuttlefish, because they have this natural expressiveness, because the color-changing machinery in the skin is directly tied to the brain and consequently registers what's happening in the brain. In some ways, the cuttlefish is a kind of perfect window into some of these questions, because you can see on its skin activity that's happening in the brain when the animal is in a sleep-like state. And so it's not surprising that cuttlefish were one of the first invertebrate animals to make it seem possible that a dream-like process might be going on in them. Now, whether it really is experiential and what they might be dreaming of, if it is experiential, I wouldn't want to be too quick on that question. I think in the case of rats, there's some little slivers of evidence that take us towards it being genuinely experiential. With cuttlefish, I have to be a little more guarded.
I love the idea of kind of imagining what rats are dreaming about, especially coming from New York City. I think it's very rich territory for them to consider for their dreams. Tell me, and then I want to move to the questions from our audience, and because I have a few of them. But before I do that, I wanted to explore just a little bit your identity as a diver, as a scuba diver, and sort of, how that provides kind of an entry point for you into these questions that you're exploring.
Yeah, I think of this as there was an enormous stroke of luck in a way. I'd always done a little bit of diving when I was younger and liked it a lot, but it didn't have any particular contact with the intellectual side of what I do, with my philosophical work, even though I was thinking about the mind and evolution and to some extent animals. And then just around the time of the beginning of the previous book, Other Minds, I began to spend more time in the water around Sydney and began to encounter cephalopods, giant cuttlefish, and then octopuses. And the fact that these beings were so engaged with me, so colorful, so active, but were also mollusks, relatives of snails and oysters and so on, that really bowled me over in a way. I thought, right, I just have to think about this. I have to think about the tree of life, the genealogical network that unifies animals on Earth in a way that pays more attention to the special properties of marine animals and the role of marine life in the evolution of animals. One of the things that's important here is the fact that there's more sheer diversity of ways of being an animal that you tend to encounter in the sea. Not just because it's there, but because you do tend to encounter it on a coral reef. Right. You're seeing animals that look like plants, animals as active as an octopus, torpedo-like fish, these sort of living toolkits that the arthropod body provides. So diving has become a source of continual stimulus and impetus towards thinking in a wider way about what it is to be an animal, the ways in which an animal can live, the evolutionary history, and consequently where we might find consciousness.
So here's a question that I had that I see reflected actually from our audience members. I was going to ask how you thought that this knowledge or increasing knowledge of animal consciousness should or does change our behavior towards animals. And Marion, one of the viewers said, wondered if we don't like to consider the consciousness of animals because of the ethical implications involved.
Yeah, look, on the last point, I think that's true. I think it's one of the ways in which we turn our eyes away from things that we should look squarely at. The question of how we should modify our behavior in the light of the new knowledge about the sheer breadth of, or the likely breadth of consciousness in the animal kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I only briefly grapple with in Metazoa, and there's going to be a lot more about it in the third book in the series. There will be a third book, which will include quite a lot about human life, and at the end, a long section on how we should live our human lives, how we should change our relationships to other animals and to our environment more broadly. I think there's a first move we can make as a consequence of the material covered in Metazoa, which is that we just need to give consideration or take into account the interests, where these are now the felt interests of a much wider range of animals than we usually have. And among invertebrate groups, I think crustaceans are a pretty clear case, and cephalopods also. We shouldn't behave as if there's much likelihood that they experience nothing. I think that's just no longer likely. Now, what we do as a consequence of this is a large further question. I don't think there's an automatic inference that follows where we need to think, okay, we now have to bestow rights on all these animals, on all sentient animals, for example. The question of how we handle rights, I think, is a more complicated question. And sentience itself is going to be, as we talked about earlier a few minutes ago, something that shades into existence that is a matter of degree. So I think there's lots of difficult questions raised, but the first thing to say is that there are many more animals whose interests should be taken into account because they're very likely to be felt or experienced interests.
Right. I have two questions sort of around a similar theme, so let me read them together. One is, how would you compare the intelligence or consciousness of Siri or Alexa, our AI devices, versus the consciousness of animals? And then the other question, kind of related question, is, do you think the development of AI will likely impart consciousness to machines in a way that we now recognize in animals?
This was a bit of a surprise to me in the development of the ideas in the book. I came to think that the ways in which nervous systems depart from just being large networks of nodes, the sort of cell-to-cell signaling picture of nervous systems like we talked about earlier, I came to think that the ways in which nervous systems are different from just signaling networks bears fairly directly on the prospects, not so much for artificial intelligence, but for artificial experience or artificial consciousness. So I think that it's not that there's an in principle possibility to us building an artificially conscious system, but I think it probably has to be something that's quite different on the hardware side from what people usually have in mind. I don't think it's realistic to take a computer like the one that we're working with now and just programming it and scaling it up, making it very big and sophisticated with the right program, and that would bring experience into being. I think that the physical peculiarities of nervous systems probably matter to that. That's a bit of a cleavage or a separation between the question of artificial intelligence and the question of artificial experience. So on this view, there's a fairly definite divide between those.
When people talk about artificial intelligence, there's a lot of it is wrapped up in this question of learning, that a machine sort of experientially sort of picks up things from the world, or trial and error style, and then sort of develops intelligence through that process of learning. If I do X, then Y happens. Is that sort of a uniquely human thing, or do you see that also sort of in the wider animal world?
It's all over animals. I think that it's, on the machine side, it's been very reasonable to explore that as a feature of intelligence that can be mechanized in ways that are both practically useful, although occasionally threatening, and ways that are also intellectually interesting. So it's a natural avenue. And what we're capturing there is not something which is distinctively human, but something which is very widespread in animals. Bees, for example, are tremendous learners, very subtle learners. And, they're invertebrates, but able to do that. And there's a wide range of learning abilities that suit different lifestyles within the animal kingdom.
Fantastic. Well, I actually think our time is up. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Peter, so much for joining us. Thank you for all those who are watching from home. And please continue to enjoy the events of the National Book Festival. Thank you.
Thanks. It was a pleasure. Thank you.